everybody. I'm so excited to see that there's so many of us in this session. I hope, like I said, we're going to have some fun. I've got a pretty packed agenda for us, and we're going to move through some things, and I'll kind of talk at length about what this session is really meant to accomplish at the end of it. So to tell you a little bit more about myself, I am a faculty member of organizational behavior. So I teach organizational behavior, I teach leadership, and I also teach career development in a business setting. So I'm at the University of Minnesota in Duluth at the Leibovitz School of Business and Economics. So today's session focuses on how it is that we create opportunities to, take that which we have and work with it in a way that's going to be suitable to our dynamic come fall, right? So I'm hoping to provide you with some best practices, but also some ideas regarding how it is that you can apply the best practices pretty directly once we convene here after the session. So here's what's in store for us this afternoon, evening, wherever you might be, morning, wherever it finds you. So our agenda, like I said, a pretty packed agenda. I've got a lot of fun stuff planned. We're going to be interactive, but we're also going to think on some of the more fundamental best practice type stuff. So I'm going to introduce the fundamentals of presence. I'm going to talk about establishing learning aims. And I know that from the agenda, there's already been some terrific sessions about both of these topics. How do we establish virtual presence, and what do we do with these learning outcomes? How do we create them for the virtual environment? We're going to talk a little bit about this integration of collaborative learning, because at the root of it, this session is really about facilitating that collaboration between the students in a way that can build on your concepts, your theories, all of the models, say, that you're introducing, and so on. As you can see in the forthcoming section, we're going to talk about emotions, because not only has COVID been an emotional roller coaster for all of us, inclusive of our students, but there's also some additional dynamics that are happening kind of behind the curtains, as it were, in the LMS or wherever it is that you might find yourself facilitating virtually. We're going to have a breakout into Zoom rooms, and I've got some parameters that I'll share with you as far as the types of things that we're going to talk about. And we're going to do a few rounds of those, because I really want to facilitate that sense of community building in the context of our gathering here this morning, afternoon, and evening. Finally, I'm going to leave you with some ideas, but also some tools, because I know that some of you might be coming here thinking around, what are some of the technologies that I can use to do that, which I'm going to talk about. So that will be our agenda for the morning, afternoon, evening. So let's start with the presence piece. Now, what I want you to do for now is to tell me how you currently feel about creating presence in your upcoming online course. So we've got a poll that's going to be coming up. So please vote. We've got some emojis there for you. So option 1, 2, 3, 4. How comfortable are you? How are you feeling about this? A lot of answers coming in. Very good. Terrific. About half of you are into the poll. Excellent. I'm only asking you to select one option. Just take a stab. Tell me how you feel about this. Looks like we've got a few more people to chime in. And my trusty co-pilot, Destiny, is going to close the poll here in just a few seconds. All right. And let's share those results. Okay. Let's look at that. So here's what we have, right? So about 5% of us are like, yeah, I got this. I'm confident. Mostly confident, 41%. Very good, right? So we've got this sense of maybe tried this before. Maybe there's a couple things that you piloted this past semester and feel pretty good about doing them again, or having learned something from them. Very good. 42%, so I'd say, right, by and large, relatively prepared, question mark, right? And my emoji for that is sort of that like flat face. We're not really sure what's going to happen and how that's going to evolve. And 9% of you are asking for some help. So I'm really hoping to key in on that 9% for sure and give some ideas as to how we move forward, but certainly increase that confidence and that self-efficacy amongst those of you who are feeling sort of prepared, but not really, right? Have some questions about it. So good. So we're all here to really start to understand how can we do this better, right? We're that type of audience that's very receptive to some of these ideas and so on. Okay, very good. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and then we're going to move on to some best practices surrounding presence. So what's this presence thing all about, right? I'm going to tell you about 3 layers. And so there is kind of a model out there, a framework called the community of inquiry. And the community of inquiry essentially says to us that we co-create, that we co-construct the learning experience with our students through some of the fundamental elements in our midst, such as content, structure, right? And I'm going to talk about this as also an emotional connection. So what this community of inquiry model suggests is that there's 3 levels, layers, as I call them, of presence. There's teaching, there's social, and there's also cognitive. And as you can see, there's some overlap in terms of how it is that these components fit together, as I said, right? The structure, the content, how is it that you're creating some of that climate? So when we think about teaching presence, we're thinking about how we organize our course, how we manage our time, right? Maybe how often we come into a discussion, how often do we post announcements and so on. And then also your technology adoption. Which shiny toys have you selected for your particular course, right? And why? When we think about the social presence, we're thinking about that meaningful facilitation, creating that connection through some of that, what I call generative dialogue, right? And there's a difference between an exchange that's sort of a one-way situation, right? And oftentimes that's, contextualizes the conversation, but a dialogue is something that's two-way. So we create that reciprocal connection. When we think about cognitive presence, we think about that reflective exchange, right? How does maybe what you learned apply to real life? What's the practical application of something that we're talking about in this course? And it's really all about that knowledge exchange. And here I'm going to emphasize kind of the peer-to-peer aspects that are going to be really important for all of us as educators to leverage. So we know that there's these 3 layers. How do we redesign, again, that which we have? Maybe it's good, maybe it's not so good, like we saw, right? 42% of us in this room are really worried about maybe not being so prepared. So here are some ideas for you to start thinking about this. I want to, again, kind of separate them out into 3 distinct categories, and I want to encourage you to create what I call multimodal content. I want you to think about infusing a flexible structure into the context of your course, whether, again, it's your LMS or something else that you're using. And I want you to think about, and we're going to talk more about what this actually means, how to create this emotional connection, but I want you to think about how you can best integrate this thing called emotional connection into your course. So multimodal content, what do I mean? We have to, right, again, looking at our circumstances, what's going on in the world and all those things, but we have to infuse our teaching with that sense of inclusivity and also make our courses accessible, right? And so the multimodalities, and again, I'll share some resources at the end of the hour that we have, but we have to sort of understand how these visual, these auditory, these tactile facets fit together into something that becomes impactful learning. I want you to also think about this idea of a flexible structure. Now, we have to create a foundation, right? No doubt about it. The teaching presence says to us that we have to manage our time effectively and create that structure to facilitate more effective learning. I've been reading lately in the Chronicle and elsewhere that, again, I'm pretty certain that it was Flower Darby that said that, but she said that you have to create structure. And if you don't give students structure, some of them are going to start to flounder. And that, again, takes away from those components of accessibility. So we have to keep that in mind. But having said that we need to create that level of structure, we also have to build an alternate pathway within that structure that we select. So I like to call this, right, almost like a choose your own adventure type of pathway, where you can infuse some options for students, whether it's a discussion prompt and you select a few questions, whether it's an exam and you ask them to maybe do one of a few things, and give them choice. We'll talk a little bit about autonomy and the importance of that as well. Finally, this emotional connection and the dynamism of that, right? The reason that I say dynamic is we all know we experience feelings, those feelings are fleeting, and then we experience something else. So it's really just energy generating through our through our bodies. So as such, right, as facilitators, we want to instill that positive energy, that good energy that we can give off to our students so that they are engaged with us and so that they are motivated to learn from us. And through that, I want to encourage all of you to think about what your feedback strategy is at the moment and how that feedback strategy can increase motivation and engagement, right? You set the expectation for what the students are going to learn. How is it that that feedback strategy is going to give you a level up in terms of getting a, kind of a closer emotional connection with your students? As we all know, it's one of those things that really begins to matter. And I'll tell you more about why in just a few seconds here. So stay with me for a second, right? So how do we do this collaborative presence piece, right? It really kind of, I can exist in a virtual environment, and I'm with you right now. I'm staring at a green dot, right? There's a bright light above me. I know that there's 100 of you on the line there, but how do I do this? How do I do this in a way that kind of resonates with me? So again, some ideas based on the types of formats or based on the types of modalities that many of us are going to be facing to choose from, whether we're going to do our courses synchronously or asynchronously, or if we're going to do a combination of both, which is going to be my case, right? So in some instances, I'll engage synchronously, but in others, asynchronously. How do I create that collaboration through both of these? So some ideas, once again, use icebreakers, have check-ins. And so I use this kind of as a mechanism, not only for my, say, struggling students, but I check in with people every so often just to kind of see how they're doing. You'd be amazed with how much that creates that sort of aspect of collaboration. They feel like they have to reciprocate, right? They kind of get that sense of, wow, I was checked in on, so I'm going to put more effort into the course. It's a really simple strategy, but it works, and it worked amazingly for me in the spring when I started to see some lack of engagement. Coffee hours, so you can call them office hours, you can call them, consultations, you can call them tea afternoons, or whatever it is that you'd like. But create that space synchronously for your students to come to. Or again, use, again, a collaborative strategy of asking them when they want to come via like a doodle poll or something similar. In terms of other ideas, so breakout rooms, we're going to play with that today. I'm sure that you've been in sessions for the last 3 days that have been wonderful in terms of these breakout rooms. They really have that capability to engage us collaboratively and cooperatively. And other aspects that are coming through are collaborative writing, and you can use a number of different modalities for that. I'll share some platforms with you tech-wise in terms of what sorts of tools are out there for you to facilitate this. Asynchronously. So I'm a huge fan of video introductions and providing audio feedback. Now, what I'll say is that these two techniques are not just limited to me. I ask my students to virtually introduce themselves for the first week of class. And I also ask them to give peer feedback in the form of audio if they feel comfortable with it, right? So I'm not forcing anybody to use that as a mechanism, but generally speaking, students are pretty receptive to that. So it's kind of a loop that I create where our presence is collaborative in the sense that we are both visually and audibly present. So it does create that sense of community in the classroom. It does let people know that there are other people on the line beyond that green dot, right? Also, announcements and discussions. Again, these might seem pretty straightforward, and I'm being a little bit more generic here just because I feel that there is this simplicity that we're missing in a lot of what's going on right now. Some of what is most impactful is going to be the most simple and straightforward. So make those announcements, again, back to the teaching presence. What's the time aspect that you want to infuse? How often are you showing up in your announcements? For instance, for myself, I show up weekly, right? So weekly, I'll send an announcement that suggests, here's the agenda for this week and here's what we're going to learn. Pretty simple and straightforward, but I know through feedback that I've received from my students, at least for the end of last semester, oh, it worked wonders. They were like, these reminders have been amazing in light of everything else that's going on in my life right now. So simple, but effective. Discussions. Also, I'm going to talk more about discussions and the value of discussions and the value of some of the other facets, such as emotions, that we can bring into our discussion forums effectively. But again, the simplicity of some of these aspects, right? And I think, there's a lot of conversations around. Make it simple. Stick to a simple strategy. So those are some of the suggestions that I have for asynchronous presence collaboratively. Now, considerations for both, and this is important. At the outset, right, we know this. We have to set clear expectations, and we have to give very, very specific instructions as to what we want. Such is the nature of the game when we're in the online environment. We have to be specific, and back to my point about structure. If we start to not infuse that structure, some students start to flounder. As I said though, right, this is a dynamic tension because we have to not only have a foundation, but also have flexibility within that foundation, right? Not the easiest thing to establish. Now, I want you to think about, again, how that presence plays into some of the other facets, not only the structure and the time management, but some of that dialogue, some of that discourse. How does that show up? Are you reinforcing the things that you want the students to take away from that which you're teaching? Right? Are you modeling some of those behaviors, which we'll talk about in just a second as well? So the last bit is ask for feedback. I mentioned this in a couple of the examples from spring. This was an invaluable technique to me to try and figure out and take a pulse in terms of where students are at, what's working for them, what maybe isn't working so well, right? It's those simple, again, those simple 3 questions. And you can use Google Docs for this. If your university subscribes to it, Qualtrics is an amazing tool as well. So just taking a pulse, kind of like we are in this session as well. So speaking of taking a pulse, here's our poll 2. How do you currently feel about establishing learning outcomes that you want your students to achieve in your upcoming course? So Destiny is going to open up poll 2 for us. There are now twice as many of us in the room, which is amazing. 126 of us. Let's hear it. How are you feeling about these learning outcomes that are slightly distinct from maybe the learning outcomes that you expect for a face-to-face situation? I'm going to take a sip of my water. Amazing, 85 coming in already. Okay, about 88. I love watching the numbers, as I'm sure you do if you're running polls. When you're running your courses, it's one of those things that really gets you excited about people being there on the other end of that infamous now green dot. Okay, so we got about 96 responses. About a minute in, so let's give it a few more seconds and then Destiny's gonna close that out for us and we'll see what happened. 98. All right, Destiny, why don't we close it and see where we stand? It's about 77% of us voted, which is a good indication. Okay, let's share some of these results. Terrific. So how do you feel about learning outcomes? I got this, right? 20%, mostly confident 40%, that's good to see. And then relatively prepared 32, and 8% are asking for some help. Okay, so good. So we're mostly confident, right, as a larger group. And at the same rate, right, I think that this is making sense to me from kind of like a quantitative standpoint, because learning outcomes, you would imagine, are going to be similar across the board when it comes to virtual courses, but also face-to-face courses, right? So yes. Oh, and it looks like we're just not showing the poll there. So yes, I think that there's some distinct capabilities that we have because we already kind of know, right, what the situation might be as far as the learning outcomes that we're striving for. But I also want to bring to your attention a few other components. And so some of those components are hopefully going to resonate for those of you that are comfortable, feeling pretty confident, but also hopefully for some of you who are looking for a little bit more guidance in the direction of how you best do this. We got little hearts. I love that. We can just leave those there. That's cool. So just like the presence piece, I want to talk about learning aims in 3 layers. So we're kind of building a layer cake here as we go along, right? The happy hour is just around the corner. So we're building a layer cake. Let's talk about 3 layers of now learning aims. So here's the 3 that I want you to think about: foundational, mediating, and ultimate. When we think about foundational aims of our course, And for those of you that are writing those learning objectives, right, and using the verbs that we would most often associate with the foundational aims are understanding and remembering. So this is recall. And for those of you that are kind of keying into what I'm getting at, yes, this is framed from Bloom's taxonomy. So we're gonna try to explore that together through the context of these aims. You can draw on my slides, that's cool, right? Someone else try to put something there. So foundational aims are low stake assignments or assessments or activities, and they're frequent. So there's kind of this gateway, and you get to assess that a lot because those are kind of the smallest bits of what your course is all about. When you get to mediating, as far as Bloom, we're talking about analysis and application. So analysis and application allow us to kind of catch students midpoint and give them something that provides for us a slightly higher level of understanding of where they're at in the course, right? And we integrate the maybe feedback and some of what we learned about their performance through the foundational context. When we get to our ultimate aims, we're looking for our students to create and evaluate, sort of synthesize, right? This is the higher order thinking skills. This is that metacognitive capacity that we talk about, and we love to really kind of incite within our students, right? So this is high stake assessments, and they demonstrate the integration of the foundational stuff that they may have learned with the mediating aims, okay? So again, building a layer cake here just to understand how it is that we lead our students in the direction of success. Now, if we gave them a very high stake aim at the end of the semester, but we didn't necessarily provide for them these steps in the ladder, right? It's a cognitive ladder to be sure, but we didn't give them that opportunity to succeed through the ladder context, we would probably lose them in terms of some of these high stake aims that we're trying to achieve with them, right? So here's the ladder, the cognitive ladder, as I'd refer to it. And I think that this is a really nice way for us to, again, through some of the verbiage, to start understanding how we can start to redesign our syllabi and specifically our learning aims, our learning outcomes. So here we are again, right? So when we're creating, we're combining, we're organizing ideas into something new. Evaluation, that's the critical thinking in terms of our decision-making capabilities. Analyze, examining distinct things as a part of a larger whole, right? So this is, I like to call this is seeing the forest and the trees, right? Apply, so we're looking to heuristics, certain kind of rules and expectations maybe in specific contexts that could be applied across to make a conclusion or resolve some sort of a problem. Understand, organizing, selecting information and knowledge. As you can see, right, we go from most complex downwards. And then identifying and recalling is the remembrance. So for those of you familiar with Bloom's, right, this is just kind of a quick overview. For those of you that are not, right, I want you to think about this as a cognitive ladder that students have to climb. You cannot get all the way to the top if you don't necessarily position students for success in the mid steps, in the lower steps, right? So all of this ties together. So that's what I want us to really think about. So when you're looking at your syllabus and you're looking at your learning outcomes as you have them at the moment, here's what I'd like you to think about. Use foundational aims to calibrate, to gauge where the students are, and support them in this ability to do very frequent, easy things, Quizlets, right? Or specific, maybe reflections, they call those things, right? Minute paper. So you can have at the end of a session, a quick minute paper that you give some nominal points for. Doing this often instills self-efficacy and self-confidence within our students to achieve these higher aims, right? So the mediating. They give us that path to structure the application of the things that we now know our students know through these foundational assessments. And so those help us catalyze those higher order learning skills. Finally, ultimate. Use those to create the space for what I call capacity building. Now, this is slightly different from capability. And the reason for that is capacity is multi-contextual. Capacity can give us leverage across contexts. So it's not only in this particular situation that I can apply that which I learned, but it's in various contexts that I can apply that, right? So this is metacognition. And again, for those of you on the line familiar with that term, that's how we get our students to really take away important things from our courses. That is our, hopefully, ultimate aim. So collaborative learning aims and action. Here's an example that I'll give you, and this is an example from my course that I created, and it's called Career Development for the Business Professional. And so here are the learning aims as I have them in my syllabus. So at the foundational level, remember this is understanding and remembrance, recall. I want them to create a personal learning network to support goal achievement through specific things, networking and individual reflection on learning experiences. Now, those are frequent, they're low stake, and they create for me a foundation for what's next, which is to establish professional goals within this roadmap that they're trying to create and work towards goal achievement through exploration of specific behaviors they might have and career anchors. So that's my mediating. I want them to analyze and I want them to apply that which they're learning. And then finally, I want them to prepare a roadmap. And notice I reference the roadmap in my mediating aim so that all of these things interconnect, just as I reference goals in my foundational aim, right? So they all have kind of the connection to this ladder. And so I want them to create this roadmap. It will serve as something that they can build on from here onward in many contexts. So not just my course, but beyond my course, right? This is kind of us saying, as we often do in the course description, students should be able to do X, Y, Z inside the class, but also outside the classroom, right? So this is how we achieve that through some of this ultimate aiming. Last poll, all right? So let's take a look at what I'm calling this kind of collaborative learning, and we're gonna spend most of our time focusing on how that fits into our pedagogy and some of the aims that we've set forth and some of that presence that we're trying to create. So Destiny's gonna go ahead and open up that last poll for us. And tell us how you feel about this thing called collaborative learning in your upcoming online course. Responses trickling in. Have a say. All right, super. There's still 120 plus hanging on the line. Terrific. 81 or so have answered. So chime in. We're going to give it another 20 seconds or so. All right, 89. Last call. 90. I feel like one of those auctioneers. All right, cool. So we've got that closed. We've got 90 of us that chimed in. Terrific. Okay, so similar to the last questions, and you're seeing the poll results right now. So 9%, or I'm sorry, 10% of you are telling me that you've got this, that you feel pretty confident about it, mostly confident, 38%, relatively prepared, 32%, and then 20% of you want some help, right? Okay, cool. So this is really, right, the foundation of this session, and I hope that as we take things into the breakout room as well, that we can really generate some of that kind of that shared knowledge and shared experience to frame the context of the help that you are looking for in your particular situation. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the best practices that I've set forth for us. Again, here we go with our 3-layer cake. I've got the 3 layers of collaborative learning. And you'll notice that the way that I'm talking about them, again, it's very pedagogical lens, right? It's not necessarily that we're looking to establish right away the technology that we're using. Again, time and time again, we're seeing that it's less about the technology, but more about the interaction, right? So those sort of shiny things are really important. In a lot of ways, they do streamline our motivation and engagement within our students. But there's also this capability that we have to do things very simply. We'll talk about the differences between the two, and I want you to think about that when we convene in our breakout groups. So trust, motivation, engagement. What I'm going to ask, right, and this is asking a lot, I know, but the encouragement here is to relinquish some of that control and ask your students for help. And I have, again, firsthand experienced this in my courses in the spring, and as I'm sure many of you that are here with us this afternoon, evening, morning, have also done that, right? So relinquishing some of that, not all, right? I'm not asking you to give up everything, but I am asking you to kind of be vulnerable with your students and basically say that sometimes you don't know how to do these things, right? So for those of you that are very confident, mostly confident that you've got this and you can create this collaborative learning environment, terrific. But for those of you, for the 20% that are looking for help, your students are one of the dominant sources of help for you in that room. And it's okay to feel vulnerable with them, right? I think that to a large extent, what I'll talk about next, which is kind of getting the emotions mixed into our cake, what you'll see is that there is a lot of that vulnerability that provides for that relationship building, which is really important. So relinquish some of that control and ask for help. So for example, you can seek input on course components for high stakes stuff. So this could be a final exam where you ask the students, what do you want your exam to be? Do you want it to be a paper? Do you want it to be a project, right? Do you want it to be something that will substantively contribute to your learning? Because again, remember, we're talking about that metacognition, that synthesis, and that can happen when there is a certain degree of autonomy that the students have to select the type of thing that they are interested in working in, and how is it that they combine those concepts. Motivation, so create some of these autonomous moments, as I call them, right? Because it is that autonomy that produces within us some additional kind of oomph to go after something. So structure, for example, the content of a midterm, and I've mentioned this before, kind of choose your own adventure, choose your own path, give some options that the students can work within, and use those options to gauge which maybe students are gravitating more so towards than others. And that could be some insightful information to use as you continue to structure your assignments for the forthcoming term. Finally, engagement. So empower students by modeling the desired behaviors. What do you want them to do, right? And in order for them to understand that, there has to be someone, like we said, present with them that creates for them that level of understanding. And I can't say enough that, right, just even expressing, you know, you got this, right? The simple aspects of kind of encouragement really get us to a next level, again, in terms of our relationship with our students, but also as reciprocated by their engagement. So, for example, in discussions, reinforce the takeaways, right? Applaud the people that have made a really fantastic point or really created some new knowledge from something and synthesized and so on. So acknowledge those contributions very actively. Again, it's up to you to create a schedule by which you want to be present. This is back to the presence facets, and I'll have some additional insights as far as how to maybe do this carefully and not to overdo it and not underdo it, right? It's a bit of a balance. So, emotions. And the reason that I kind of tossed this into our conversation about collaborative learning is several-fold, all right? So I'm gonna focus us on our terminology for just a second, because again, knowing who's in the room, there might be people that are completely aware of what an emotion is and how it kind of corresponds to a feeling and so on. But for those of you that are maybe not so sure, there are several pieces that we should talk about. So affect is the first thing I want to define, which is the influence, the trigger, and then the intensity. So that is the kind of the contextual stimulus for an emotion and thereafter a feeling. So an emotion is a contextually stimulated, oftentimes unconscious state. And our feeling is that kind of overt expression of the emotional state, whether it is conscious or unconscious. So important to define our terms, and I'll tell you why. Emotional contagion is real. We're living that right now. There are so many dynamics in our midst, right? You turn the television on and all of a sudden you're upset, right? And there's a lot of ways by which this comes across as well in relation to how it is that our students see that within us, right? Now, the one thing I want to focus on, again, in light of some of the more recent events that have been happening as far as making sure that our courses are accessible, that there's a level of inclusion, we have to keep an eye on that emotional stuff that's happening behind the curtain. So be very mindful of some of that undercurrent that you might be experiencing, right? You might be experiencing it from either hearing from certain students or just kind of picking up a vibe, right? Getting the sense of that energy, that there might be isolation, that there might be a level of loneliness and maybe exclusion. So how can you, as again, that presence in the room, be the person to facilitate that level of inclusivity? And finally, emotional labor. is also very real. And we know this, right? Spring was pretty tough for most of us. There was a lot of upheaval, and at a certain point, our fuses were, pretty much burned out. We had to figure out very quickly how to do something we haven't done. And that takes a lot of energy away from us, right? And amidst that, there were all these other things going on, right? That were consistently leading us in the direction of sort of low energy levels and lack of motivation and so on. So because of that being the case, right? This is another reason why I talk about this, because we are short fused maybe in terms of our emotional energy. And let's just say that's combined with an undercurrent of isolation and exhaustion and so on the student end, right? That really doesn't bode well as far as you creating that collaborative setting. So I want you to really intently think about those things in the mix and how it is that you can more effectively address them. Again, my one key word to a lot of this is going to be that sort of reciprocal vulnerability. Being human, right? Being kind to ourselves and maybe doing less and being okay with that, and really centering on what's important as far as that connection and relationship that you're establishing through that emotional connection, rather than really kind of overdoing it on some of the techie stuff, or really kind of, droning on about how it is that you're going to structure these assignments and are they going to be consistent with the expectations that you set forth, right? We have to be realistic in many ways. Fall is going to be tough, right? Let's face that. So here's what we're going to try to do to address this, right? We're going to bring our very smart brains together with our hearts and really put it in perspective as far as the things that we can focus on. So for those of you in the room with us, you might know parts of this as components of emotional intelligence. So this is a construct that I research. And so actually, again, the reason I talk about emotions is because it's a large component of the research that I do on leadership and its development. So I want you to think about how we can connect cognitive and affective aspects of our learning. Again, we sort of defined affect as that trigger, right? That aspect of intensity. And we're going to do this by looking at self-awareness, self-management, the individual pieces of the puzzle, and then social awareness and relationship management. And those are the collective pieces of the puzzle. So let's bring it all together. Engaging self-awareness. Now, and I'm going to ask you to do this when we're in our breakout rooms here in just a few minutes. Reflect through perspective taking. Notice your reactions to things, right? So slow down and notice that emotion or that feeling and how it is that it eventuated. What was the contextual stimulus for it, right? And what could be done to offset some of that which is happening. Building confidence and self-efficacy. Now, we often strive to do this with our students, right? This is part of us creating that environment where students can learn and be more self-efficacious and self-confident. Now, it's a two-way road. Just as I was polling all of you and asking how confident you might feel about something, right? That's our self-efficacy and our self-confidence on the line. So we have to be aware of, if we're having negative self-talk, right, that's obviously going to translate into some of what the students perceive about us. So we have to enact positively, right? And maybe you've read about this thing called growth mindset. I'm sure you have, right? But there's a lot of research out there that supports this idea that if we rewire our thinking, that alone will give us greater levels of self-confidence and self-efficacy. Our self-concept as a teacher, as a facilitator, will increase inevitably. So again, a suggestion is to maybe, as I mentioned before, invite your students to collaborate. Create that level of self-awareness. What's happening, what's working for them, and what's not. Use that to get some feedback on your syllabus. Again, a risky maneuver, right? Why would I turn my syllabus over to my students? But there are ways by which we can ask for some feedback and really get a lens into what it is that they're thinking, and that's perspective taking. Practicing self-management. This one's tough, especially given what we are all going through, right? It's not easy for us to maybe control some of the emotions that we experience and some of the feelings that show up in our behaviors. But so we have to regulate as best possible that which bubbles up to create that level of self-discipline. So think about how, in the moment, you can kind of take control of that which shows up for you and more explicitly address it. So some research says out there, right, that the magic number for this transformation of a feeling or maybe, kind of an intense emotion and to hone in on what it's doing to us and recalibrate it is 6 seconds. So we've got 6 seconds to switch it up. And if you use those 6 seconds, right, and within those 6 seconds recognize what's going on and you manage it and you reframe it, right, you've already outlived that particular emotion. So emotions, again, kind of go through us. It's a cycle, it's an energy. And there's things we can do to optimize the things that we are feeling and experiencing, such as our, again, cues coming off to our students. To my second point, right? They see that. Virtual, face-to-face, right? They see that. So we have to kind of model some of which we want them to come away with, which is positive emotions, right? Rather than the negative. So remember, again, positive can eventuate from something maybe that's not so positive in a short time span of about 6 seconds. So, for example, I'd like you to think about how maybe to emphasize this component, you can record that weekly announcement, 2 minutes, right, tops, using your favorite tool, and I'll share some things that I particularly like, but really use that as a means to express, right? Maybe make a joke. I crack jokes at my students all the time, and some of them are effective and some of them are not so successful, but yet I persevere, right? I continue to make those jokes. I continue to stick to my guns when it comes to really understanding that that humor piece really connects me through the context of changing up maybe even how I feel, right? So I might not be feeling particularly a positive thing, right? But through that context of making a joke about something, then I turn it around as well. So that's why I said it's contagious, it's a cycle, it's dynamic, it's energy. So moving on to some of these collective facets to my last segue there. So how do we raise that idea of kind of social awareness that's happening in our rooms, in our classrooms, in our virtual spaces? So express that empathy, right? And empathy is different from sympathy. Sympathy is just sort of kind of weighing in and saying, yeah, right? But empathy is really sitting with what's going on and letting the other understand what's going on for themselves. So it's more kind of giving space to think and talk through things, kind of like a sounding board. So tap into what the students are anxious about. Maybe ask them some open-ended questions that would guide them in the direction of that real self-reflection versus making suggestions off the top of your head and providing that advice to something that they might not be necessitating, right? So practice compassion too, create that trust and rapport. I showed that to you as one of the foundational facets of creating that collaborative environment in your course. So trust is going to be combined with the student's motivation to achieve and their level of engagement that's continuously expressed towards the ultimate learning aims that you've set for your course. And so I call this kind of, again, in some of the research that I've done, relational coordination, right? That it emerges very naturally when you've got all these various ingredients and they all comprise something wonderful, something that's collaborative, something that is dynamic and ongoing. So think about how you can instill that using what you have, maybe using parts of what you have, but also some techniques that would be most expedient for your students and the students would be most receptive to. So that would be my suggestion. Again, being a bit more general, we've got people from various disciplines here in the room. And so I want us to really think about this specifically in our breakout rooms in a second. Example, really quickly here. So adopt an outreach tactic. So this high touch and checking in, and I mentioned this earlier. So this idea is that if I give an exam and I see that some of my students didn't do so well, those will be the prime contenders for me to contact and say, hey, how's it going? What's going on, right? How can I help? So that easy maneuver really gets us into that I'm aware of what's going on, right? And that presence resonates, and you create that continuous loop of the cooperative effort for your students to achieve and also succeed. Finally, I'm building up to it, right? We've got the relationship management. So acknowledge what students are doing, right? Acknowledge how it is that they're contributing to the things that you've set out for them as far as the aims are concerned. Optimize their self-efficacy, right? We talked about our self-efficacy and self-confidence waning, but also how is it that maybe, as a consequence of us building up and modeling some of those positive behaviors, our students can take that away as well through some of the feedback that you give them, right? I call this kind of emotional cheerleading to some extent, sustaining that motivation and engagement through saying, you can do this, right? You got this, right? Some of the simpler things that you can say, but they will pay off tenfold. Again, in my experience, that has definitely been the case. So for an example, I want you to consider how it is that you can empower through that shared decision-making process. I know it sounds a little scary if we relinquish our control, right? It's like, wait, hold on, you want me to give up some of what I'm in control of, right? Don't I structure this so that the students can succeed and they have a distinct pathway? Yes. But you also, again, remember, you're creating flexibility and you're creating autonomy within the things that they can select, right? It's a menu a la carte, right? You want a piece of cake or you want another sweet, right? So you have to infuse some of that into the structure and really catalyze that sense of emotional connection, as I call it, okay? So here's our breakout prompt, and we've got 88 of us on the line, which is terrific. And so what I want us to think about is using some of the things I discussed. So intentional presence, learning aims, creating that cooperative synergy, and fusing in that emotional vulnerability, as they call it. Question for you all: how can you collaborate with your students to redesign components of your upcoming online course? Well, we're back together again. All right, and I'm looking at our time, and we're just about at the right time to engage in some active reflection together. So got a couple more things to say, and I'm hoping that those things will reinforce the things you've been mentioning in your breakout groups. Again, the rooms that I was part of were just fascinating to take things from different contexts. So I'm really glad that I framed my approach, and hopefully the metaphor of the layer cake will stick with you. And you'll see too, of course, I'll share the slides so you have that information for future reference. I know a lot of people were kind of taking notes as you were going along. But so the layer cake is important, and I wanted to add emotions into our layer cake as kind of a key ingredient, one you cannot miss. In fact, one that probably changes the dynamic of everything that's to come. So I have some suggestions, and I'm still sharing my screen. So let's see, should be able to see it now. Okay, and I'm going to minimize myself and maximize all of you. But okay, so we're done with our breakout. The last thing that I want us to talk about is just some ideas. So here's some ideas that I've kind of mulled over, and here's some of the things that I'm going to do or have done already, pedagogy wise. All right, so this is pedagogy because we have to think about what that ultimate learning piece means as far as thinking on what are the technologies that we can integrate to facilitate it, to lead it. So ideas: write a manifesto for teaching online, right? We are often, when we are job hunting, we're asked to share a teaching philosophy. Use that as a document to reframe your thinking around what that looks like online. It's different, right? We have to recognize that there's some distinctions between those two. Restructure your syllabus, and as I've been saying, this is kind of a favorite of mine, and I'm asking my students to do this as well. Kind of creating this collaborative, creating this collaborative product. So make a plan to also scale up your interactions throughout the semester. Use those 3-layer aims that I gave you. So you've got foundational stuff, mediating stuff, and ultimate stuff. When you scaffold that stuff for your students, they have a better chance of getting to the higher order aspects, right? As has been talked about in chat, right? There's this Bloom connection that we're making. Create a plan for how you're going to respond to the forum post. This is back to the teaching presence, right? Creating a structure of sorts. How are you going to manage your time? Balance your quantity and quality, because that's going to be the component that allows you to better manage your emotional load. We're all going to have it, right? So just might as well recognize it at the present and decide how it is that we're going to address that. If we are forthcoming with our students and say, we are going to check the forum, right, 3 times a week, and here's what I'm going to put into my planner to do that, and stick to that schedule, our emotional load is going to be more balanced, right, than say under-delivering or over-delivering on something. So again, we are also emotional, not just our students, and we have to create that sense of mutual understanding, right? Revise an assignment. This is probably an easier one, and many of you have probably already done that, right? So adopt an assignment that maybe you created for a face-to-face situation into an online environment somehow. And create a discussion prompt, as I said, with several pathways. So oftentimes I'll give my students different kind of modalities to explore. So maybe they want to answer a question and they want to write stuff out. Maybe they want to share a picture. A very successful thing I did last semester in one of my courses was students sharing memes on a specific topic. I think it was conflict management. And I said, find me a meme and share it with your small group, discussion group, in terms of what conflict management means to you, right? So that's another kind of pathway that you can give them. The more autonomy they get, right, the better streamlined their efforts are in terms of engaging with you and overall being motivated to achieve. All right, finally, you're probably all waiting for this one, right? Here's some tools. These are kind of just a quick overview, a bit of a selective menu, I would say. But as you can see, yet again, I'm focusing on these 3 areas that I've introduced to you, which is presence, and we talked about accessibility in that. So we've got Voki, we've got Flipgrid, we've got VoiceThread. These are all links, and I'm going to share my slides so you'll be able to click right on it and then get to where you need to go. But so Voki is an avatar app. So if you wanted to be really inventful and create an avatar of yourself to share with your students, and that would be the persona, the presence, you could do that. Flipgrid is amazing. It's super easy, right? And it's just like a minute or however long you want to make the video. And it's something that I have my students use to do their video introductions, and that I use also myself. VoiceThread is the audio piece, Audacity as well, and then some accessibility stuff. So Chrome Voice Note and also Chrome Vox. So check those out if you're looking to make sure that your course is accessible across the board, that you're not kind of encountering color issues, right? There's all the text that's maybe kind of looking a little odd and so on. So there's different apps out there that are there for you to check to make sure that your courses are in fact, designed for inclusivity and accessibility. Learning aims. So we've got Coggle, we've got Mindomo. So these are really cool because this is all like mind mapping. So if you think about some of these higher order thinking skills, so the mediating aims and also the ultimate learning aims, we're looking at Coggle, we're looking at Mindomo. Check them out. Really simple and straightforward to get going, but they're really neat in terms of students latching onto them as methods by which they can engage with each other, which is my kind of more cooperative learning piece. Meet-Quo and Hypothesis. So Hypothesis is something that I mentioned related to the syllabus collaboration. And Meet-Quo similarly is also something that you can kind of co-design specific aspects of projects and so on. More cooperation tools, all right, so Evernote, probably heard of that one, but that's just kind of a way to organize everyone's thinking, and schedules could also be part of that. Discord is, and I know that there's some music people out there, so there might be some familiarity with Discord, but that one is really cool because you can set up channels for interaction. So you can create small groups. It is a discussion platform, so to speak, but that could be a platform that's useful if you wanted to take it outside of your LMS, let's just say, and do something where the students get to interact more intuitively, right? So it's more like, there's a capacity in there to do chatting and so on that the students can do independently, which I know that oftentimes they'll go outside of the LMS to do that anyway through whether it's WhatsApp or, some other mechanism. Miro and Jamboard. So these are really neat because, again, this is kind of ideation. This is that higher order creating and synthesizing and evaluating, back to Bloom. So again, they're all free, super fun. Jamboard's actually part of Google Suite. And you can see here, right, that I'm not mentioning Zoom, that I'm not mentioning some of these other things that we are well aware of now. I wanted to purposefully leave you with some specific tools that are maybe not so familiar. And if you have questions about them and you're, kind of thinking on how to adopt something and you want to chat about it, by all means. Okay, so these are some of the tools that I wanted to recommend, as I know that there's a lot of sessions out there that focused on Zoom, how to use Zoom and so on, but these are other things that might be useful. Hopefully they will be useful. Okay, so in the chat, this is my final slide. I'd like you to share what sticks with you, what you're unsure about. How can Course Hero help you? Okay, feel free to tackle any of these questions. And I've got my faithful co-pilots here with me, Richard and Destiny, and we're gonna quickly hop into the chat and kind of see what's going on, get another final pulse. I'm being mindful of our time. We've got about 6 minutes or so till the end. Let's have it. We've got about 60 of us on the line still, which is amazing. Thank you all for being here. And I'm going to open up the chat and I'm going to see what it is that is happening in there. So go back. Oh, and it looks like my chat is still here from the previous session. Okay, so Destiny, Richard, if you want to chime in and let me kind of know if things are happening in the chat and how I can address them. Looks like I'm back.
Sure. Sonia just commented to say that the use of breakout rooms, that's something she or he or whoever it is planning to try. Jane recommended Seesaw.
Yes, Seesaw.
Where you familiar? If you want to give an overview.
Yeah, so I'm also seeing Marco Polo. So there's a lot of, again, and it looks like right. So it's kind of right. So someone had mentioned what it is. It's sort of like a digital portfolio. So depending on the discipline that you're in, you might have other tricks and tips to give to others. So please, yeah, if you have other suggestions based on some of the things that I said, please share them in the chat. That'd be terrific. So we've got some more teach back session, incorporation, terrific. Excellent. So how to get students to collaborate and form a community. I'm assuming that that's like what 6, right? Synchronous, I've not attempted it, but teaching asynchronously, very good, right? Because I think that the collaboration, the cooperation really comes from these basics that you infuse, right? I'm going to continue with our cake metaphor and say that, yeah, we can't have a very good tasting cake if our ingredients are not up to snuff, right? If we don't have good ingredients, we're not going to have a good end product. And I think that, you know, at the end of it, you can think about community collaboration in these virtual spaces as your very tasty cake, right? Let's see.
We're getting a lot of folks, yep, recommending tools and also talking about trying to integrate emotional content, but also giving the students more ownership. I did catch one question from Tologon. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this goes outside of your discipline, but are these tips applicable in engineering fields? Maybe we can broaden that question to say, is there anything here that is really limited to certain disciplines?
Absolutely not. And so I think that my intent for designing it, right, speaking of kind of foundational, mediating, and ultimate aims, the ultimate aim was to make it as generalizable as possible by infusing some things that are really kind of not unique to any of us, right? That this, especially this emotional piece, and I would say in an engineering context too, that could very well be applied in the frame of not only you yourself kind of looking at yourself as an educator and figuring out what are some of these things that I need to work on, but also sharing that with the students and asking them what it is that they want. So I love that. Yeah, I'm actually really grateful that someone did say that, yes, interdisciplinarily, this all applies, right?
Absolutely. I'm seeing another question. Again, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Can you share your strategy of dividing people into small groups in breakout rooms? And if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's not about how do you do breakout rooms on Zoom, but more so how do you kind of determine how those groups are organized?
Yes, very good. That's a really great question. So there is a bit of a magic number, right? Again, I gave you a magic number with the number of seconds that it takes from a positive emotion to be negative or vice versa. Kind of, you know, again, from my discipline, which I teach management, so we talk a lot about this, it's the number 6, right? So 6 to 8 people, depending on your class size. 8 is probably cutting it a little too far. 6 is that place where generative discourse can take place, and where if some people want to process their ideas, you know, maybe more on the introverted side, they could take a little bit of that time and have some lead in. And, you know, again, it's really important to make sure that you structure that, right? Here's that teaching presence yet again for effective collaboration. If you've got a group of 15 people in a breakout, you're probably not going to get a lot of content generated, and a lot of people are probably going to do a similar thing that they do in the classroom, which is sit back and let others do the work, right? So 6 is something that I would stick with if you can make it smaller, if you have to make it smaller, for sure. But if you go above 6, or, you know, again, worst case scenario 8, then you are looking at questionable engagement, I would say.
That's wonderful. I'm seeing another question from Lisa. And if I'm understanding it correctly, how do you approach mitigating the balance of approaching ethical topics of emotional current events with students, vulnerability, etc.? So essentially, is there, and this is interesting, this is something we were talking about in our breakout group, is there a line that's, you know, that you try not to cross, and how do you decide where that is?
That is such a terrific question, right? And I think there's been a lot of sessions today and yesterday that head-on dealt with this. You know, how do we approach this in the classroom, how we talk about these sensitive topics, and where is everyone at in terms of them. I would say that it's important as an educator, as a facilitator, to have that boundary. But I would also, kind of like I said about structure, invite some of that participation, because if you don't allow that to be an element of your design, you might just be missing out on something really critically important. For instance, I'll say, you know, and ethics is a huge component of the, you know, organizational behavior course that I teach, because we talk about responsible leadership, right? And kind of corporate social responsibility and so on. So I actually invite my students to tell me where they are at with these current topics. A good example of that would be, hey, you know, provide me with a link, or provide your group with a link to an article about a current issue and how that fits into something that we're talking about course related. If it's not related to my discipline, right, that's a more challenging question, I would say, right, because you want the students to stay on topic. But I would still invite that as a potential contextual element. And this goes along with what I said about really kind of being that flexible person and saying, okay, we are going to experiment with some of this and be vulnerable together. And maybe I need your help along the way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for everyone who attended, for your engagement. Of course, thank you, Dr. Elgayeva. I mean, this was really, really terrific. And we are at time. And so I know folks have to run to dinner or to lunch or whatever it is that you have coming up in a bit. We do have 2 different receptions tonight. So we hope to see you there. And again, thank you all for joining. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And thank you, Kate.
And I'm putting my email in the chat for those of you that want to reach out. I know a couple of you in my rooms wanted to, so I am thanking all of you so much. I thank you for being vulnerable with me. Thank you for infusing some of that energy into the rooms that you were in, and thank you to my trusty co-pilots, Destiny and Richard, and thank you for this opportunity. I hope to see you all in one of the happy hours. It's officially that hour. Woo! We did it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks again.
Signing off.